Hi, I'm Liz.
And I'm Marie, and this is Mock It, a podcast sponsored by MetroStar, where we take a deep dive look into UX design, trending design topics, and chat with our friends in the field. Let's get started.
So for today's episode, we have Traci Walker back with us of the DSC. Thanks for joining us again.
Hi, happy to be back.
Great. So for today, we're going to be walking through the changing culture of government and embracing design. So with that, for those who didn't hear the first, our first podcast that goes with this, of the introduction of the DSC, can you just do a quick elevator speech about yourself and the DSC?
Sure. The Digital Services Coalition was founded in 2019. It is a nonprofit trade association which now represents 28 different companies that focus on digital service and digital transformation. I have been here for a year now as the executive director, and previously I came from the United States Digital Service, where I was the director of the digital service procurement team there, and also was at the beginning of U.S. Digital Service when they started in 2014. And completed 20 years in the federal government as an IT contracting officer.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. So you have 20 years of experience. So,
I do.
Yeah. The government usually leads with technology first, and it was like the commercial private side that really pulled into the UX approach. Can you talk about how government started out with design and like how they thought about it?
I don't think government thought about it. No.
I was like, or how they started to.
No, I take that back. I mean, I think it's just one of those misunderstood aspects of technology and how you bring in new technology and how do you adopt trends and what are you trying to focus on. And so right now, in terms of where industry has been, and we talk about, development of what we find as modern products today and what we're used to, that started, in the early 2000s. And those trends started to come through the commercial industry. And government wasn't very up to speed on that. And it still is struggling with understanding what is, the new technology trends and how to get into them and stuff. And so I think even though jumping, forward to some of the buzzwords like AI and machine learning, all of that comes back to having a understanding of design and of the building practices that have to be in place before you can jump to those new technologies. And so kind of rethinking where waterfall practices don't necessarily apply and aren't really used anymore in terms of software development. What does that mean to take away the idea that design was usually done in a room with people working on requirements, completely separate from the rest of the group? And I've done that myself in the past. We sit there for many, many months and come up with all the requirements that we think would possibly have to be in something, and then we get working on it and realize that none of those things actually were as important, or that even if we stuck to them and said, this has to happen, somehow that usually broke what we were trying to do. And it didn't really solve the issue that we were, working to fix. So where design now is coming in and looking at the human factor of it, we call it human-centered design. Mm-hmm. What is it that we need to use, or what is it that people who interface with government need to use, and how are they going to be able to do that? I think one of the challenges that government is always going to have with adoption of new technologies is it is compliance-based. There are a lot of regulations and a lot of rules that have to be met for certain reasons, for laws or for usability or other requirements. But there's a difference between what is an actual rule or what is a practice that has been implemented. And so when you're looking at design and looking at those business processes, that really is uncovering what needs to be changed for a real reason versus what was just something that everybody had done before. So I think as government is thinking through and doing more projects like this, they're looking at that perspective and kind of rethinking it. And that's really what the benefit of bringing in design into government is looking and saying, we're not just updating technology. We're transforming it. And that's the digital, transformation versus just typical modernization. Modernizing something is making it the new version of it. Transforming it is saying, is the practice and is what it's doing actually serving the need? And those are two different questions or outcomes. So I think where, the idea of modernization can happen sometimes without the aspect of design, but digital transformation absolutely cannot. So as agencies are learning what those two things are, making sure that they are thinking through it from that design lens first, and then applying the technology and the pieces and the tools that come after it is probably the most important thing.
Nice. Yeah. It's like asking why are we doing this?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why have you done it like this? And is there a better way?
Yeah. A lot of times that why has been the people that can answer that why aren't even there anymore.
Yeah. You're like, okay.
Yeah. Like, oh, I just keep doing this. But why? But I don't know. But we keep doing this. But why? Mm-hmm. And design goes and asks those questions. Yeah. Whereas a lot of times just oh, I need something new doesn't necessarily answer the question of why do you need something new or do you need something different? Mm-hmm. And those are two different questions.
Yeah. Awesome.
So with the focus on human-centered design and customer experience design, we know that those are elements that make up this digital transformation that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. Do you have any examples that you want to share about how the government has used these tactics to bring great design to their users and to the nation?
Well, I will give a little nod to MetroStar here. I was one of the USDS projects I worked on was for farmers.gov, and something that you guys took on as the front end Drupal piece of that, and really seeing how the experience for farmers was able to change, and learning a lot through the design process from that was fascinating, because it's not an area that you necessarily think of all that much, but the challenges are, you're talking about farmers in rural America who are not necessarily going to turn to technology as their first answer for what they need to do for themselves. They're going to turn to their local, USDA farm representative and go to talk to them. Well, that person then is the one who has to interface with a lot of the technology or the forms, or to help them get a loan, or, helping them do the job that they need to do, and not really going and saying, okay, my first stop is going to be on my phone or on a computer to go to USDA website to figure out what that is. And I think that the farmers.gov implementation, and this is, shout out to a lot of the great feds that were also on this project, as they were all looking at that and saying, we need to look at this from a different perspective. So I thought that was a great project, and really showed and highlighted what the face of, farmers.gov is. And so that was one great example. I don't know if you had any insider knowledge on that one that you guys were particularly,
Yeah, no, I did not personally. I know some of my coworkers from other projects were on it. I know with farmers, and then going off of that project, within the pandemic, I know the team brought up some platform super fast, like incredibly fast, because they had all that human-centered design built in. The team had put the time and energy into a pattern library. So they were able to, like you said, they were repeating things to answer the problem quicker and faster, because the backbone was there.
That's great. Yeah. I think other examples that I've seen maybe more recently, I know there's a lot of work, and this isn't just at the federal level, but at kind of at the state and local, with the areas that need to be fixed for unemployment. There were a lot of challenges to the unemployment systems at states, and where does that need to be, looked at, and how can those be improved? So I think there's a bigger effort right now in looking at that from a whole perspective and saying unemployment systems, how do we make these easier? How do we bring that out and upgrade it and make this more user-friendly for the people who are very unhappy with the fact that they, need to be able to get benefits and figure things out. And so really where the best examples of user design is that the people don't have to think about their interaction with what they're using. So if design is forgotten about, that means it's successful.
Right. And these are both examples of folks are in crisis at this moment, right? Like with farmers, right? Either I've just lost my full crop because of some natural disaster, right? Or I've lost my job and now I have all these. So it's that also designing for crisis. So you don't want them to have to think, like you were just saying. So that's a huge portion of it.
That's a great point. Yeah, I love how you phrase that. So you've shared that you have 20 plus years of experience in the government. We do some work with acquisitions. And so I'm excited to ask this question. What does design look like from the procurement side of things?
Procurement is always a fun challenge in government. I think, just kind of going back to where we were in U.S. digital service and things that we talked about a lot there, but also in the DSC, the things that government are plagued with a lot of times is the acquisition process and the hiring process. And so really looking at like, how do we get people into the government and working with government? So from the acquisition standpoint, a lot of work and change has been done around the idea of actually doing design challenges as opposed to just doing tech challenges, or to really bring forward what are your things that you use to show us how you do good design. Talk about your strategy and your methodology around what is design and how do you bring it into your project, as opposed to government dictating and say, you shall have designers on here. And in some cases that still happens, but a lot of what we were trying to do, both at USDS and now from the Digital Services Coalition perspective, is really get to those questions and getting away from here's the solution that we're asking for first from an acquisition perspective and saying here's our problem that we're trying to solve. So the idea of a statement of objective. Here's our objective. And then tell me your process and methodology through which you're going to do that. That's changed a lot from how, we used to buy tech services in the back. It was, tell us how many people you're going to have on this, tell us what they're going to do and their skill sets and their labor categories, and we'll put them in there. And then somebody from the program side will be monitoring to make sure the work gets done. But it really didn't tie back to the right kind of metrics or incentives. And I think that's a big change in acquisition as well, is looking and understanding what different metrics are being applied to contracts and under contracts, under performance-based contracts, so that you're getting the outcomes, as opposed to just saying, did everybody show up, do their work? Okay, they've signed off on their time cards. That's good. But what is the output that you're actually getting? And so relooking at that and then bringing that forward in the solicitation phase and asking companies, what's your methodology for this? How are you going to do it for us? And then show me where you've done it before. Tell us your story is a big difference from we're going to tell you what to do. And so really learning what makes that subject expertise. I hope, the technical evaluators have that same knowledge of what that makes up, and being able to accurately get the right kind of companies on board and really having that conversation through the acquisition process, as opposed to it just being here's industry and here's government and we're going to have this big wall in between us. Because that is one of the challenges of government work, is there is typically that wall. And what we've tried to break down is opening that communication up earlier in the solicitation process. And then starting from the beginning, when you go in for a kickoff or something, is opening up the door and having those conversations up front and build trust. And when trust comes through, then you can start having those conversations around, end users' feelings or emotions or what they have. But a lot of times those things aren't brought into acquisition and contracts, and the language that you write is very structured and compliance-based and risk avoidance. And it isn't around the idea like, okay, we don't know what this outcome is going to be. We don't know how to estimate this. It's a process that we have to go through together. And a lot of times there's a lot of fear when it comes to that. So I think that's, one of the challenges that and opportunities for government is that shift and that change. And so we're here to, hopefully provide examples of where that works really well, but also show where it doesn't work, because a lot of times you learn through the mistakes what not to do on the next time. And so building in the capacity to have mistakes on a contract is another big thing that we're seeing. And you fail fast and fail often means that you're overall successful. As opposed to it just being, okay, we've messed up, we're done now. Okay, let's go on to the next one. So.
No, I love that notion of failing fast. That's probably you're laughing at me. I think that's such a, I think when someone hears that term, they're like, oh, that's like, you don't want to fail fast. You want to succeed. So, but it's like that juxtaposition of you are succeeding by failing fast because you know it's not working, and then you can switch gears and be agile about it. So I love that you brought that up. So one thing to kind of piggyback on what you were saying, and I know you've heard this a lot too, is with design, people are like, oh, just make it look pretty. That's all the design is. Like, just make it look pretty. Like, have all of those people come up with the just like we were saying, like requirements on. And then like at the end, just package it up. It'll be fine. So how How do you think how do you think the government's transformed to really accept UX design and customer experience first? And what sort of metrics have been used to show that, like, yes, design is not just making something look pretty. It has all this background with putting the users first. How has that shifted, and how do you think it will continue to shift?
I think that sometimes going back to the basics of understanding what design actually is and correlating it to something else that people have a good understanding of helps to make that transition a little bit. So I have a sister who's an architect, and you don't think of building a large building without having an architect on record, right? You don't necessarily go to the construction manager first and say, okay, I want you to build this building. They're going to be like, okay, well, we can rinse and repeat what we did on our last project if you just want to do that, because we've already done that. Yeah. But we're going to defer to you getting an architect first, because they're going to be the ones that has to understand what are your specific requirements to have in here, and how is it going to look, and what do we need to change, and stuff along those lines. So if you look in, and kind of tying back a little bit to the last question around acquisition, there's a whole section in the FAR around construction contracting. And in there, they actually talk about how very different processes for acquisition, which I think should be adopted more in our world. But they call architecture an art. And because it's an art, you can't necessarily evaluate it the same way that you can another technical skill. And so looking at this and saying we're getting into more of a softer skill around the concept of art, but also understanding that through that design and through that creativity is going to come the solution that is ultimately going to be, the best for what people need to do to get there. Creativity, something, that isn't necessarily always pushed. And, I don't necessarily, I think creativity a lot of times is the word that people look for when they say the word innovation. And I think that's really what they're looking for and saying, like, okay, we're being creative around our solutions. And so highlighting and using UX and user research and understanding where that creativity can come into play is a big deal, and not something that is kind of traditionally thought of or that there should even be time for. And that's a big thing too, is making time in projects for the creativity to the point where then the creativity is good and great, but we now actually have to start building something. And I'm pretty sure you know this, like there's always that point of when you say, well, we could design all day long, right? Yeah. Like how do you help, like in your mind, what's the best way to start, stop from like designing and going into like building, or is there, good, kind of ideas around like how to do that? Or
yeah, so one way that I've found to be successful is we call it snackable bites, because it's very big on, from that waterfall, again, like you could design it all and then you get somewhere and we're not failing often and fast to redirect. So we try to build out snackable bites, or, in Scrum, it's called your features. So really breaking down that every feature is speaking back to your user problem, and we go and knock out that one. And evaluate it, and then move on to the next one. And, as we're learning from that snackable bite, you have time to make those changes and not like a bunch of technical debt, because you're like, oh crap, we just made something no one wants. So instead, right, it's smaller features of the whole. You're like, oh, let's adjust that feature to be more closely aligned to what is actually addressing the needs. And then, it's like a puzzle. All those features become the final product. And that's how we've tackled it. I'm sure there's other ways to go about it. I like a lot of food metaphors, so the snackable bites is something that I'm stuck with.
I definitely, and that goes to the creativity, that you can bring in other ways of describing things, that make it more adaptable, I think, to people's understing of over technical terms. People get lost in the weeds with that.
Yeah, I think, and you mentioned it earlier, like talking about it within a context people are used to. And right, we eat every day. So.
Well, I think I remember on the contract we had for farmers.gov, we wrote into the contract that sprint sizes were going to be in chickens, goats, and cows, as opposed to small, medium, and large. Yeah, so awesome. We were building with, agriculture, and really loved and thought that was great from both sides of how much fun that was to have a contract that actually had those things in there and saying like, oh gosh, our sprint sizes are based, is that a chicken? Is that a goat? Is that a cow? Those are ways to kind of make the process fun. And I know from the government side and anybody's side is that when you've made a decision and then you can see that decision come to fruition very quickly and you get that win, that's a huge motivator for everybody. And that feels really good because a lot of times on contracts and a lot of times in projects, you don't see the outcomes, especially from the back end staff, like the people from the contracting, side, the cores, even the product owners to some point. You don't necessarily see how the outcome can actually be implemented with the end user. And, I think on that farmers.gov one, again, when the first piece was launched, everybody in the team, even, the cores and everything went down to the farmer's market and was like, hey, have you seen this? What would you want? And having that tangible experience of like asking somebody a question of like, what would you like to see better is a big difference from like stepping back from the piece of paper that a contract is written on or a business process is written on and actually understanding that that's going to translate to somebody using it and getting to see that as a big, I encourage and hope that from industry's perspective, you bring not only the stakeholders who are the immediate stakeholders, but that surrounding group that helped make that part of it, your contract people, your hiring people, onto those projects to show them the outcome of it too, because everyone wants to feel like they're part of that bigger thing. And a lot of times getting head down, get the work done doesn't allow you to have that experience. So from, the design perspective, you get to have all that fun,
I love that example that you're sharing with going down and like talking to people and getting their feedback. So can you describe to us what you would say the difference is between user experience and customer experience?
Absolutely. This is a topic that has come up a lot recently with the executive order being released, and what does customer experience mean for the government, and how do we use it, especially in the digital transformation, and that they're not the same word and they don't have the same meaning, but one can directly, they're both affect each other. So, an example of this that I've used recently is that if you're thinking about a government claims process for whatever that might be, benefits of some sort, and your experience with the government is that, let's say that your claim did not get processed. As a customer of the government, you may not be happy with the government because your claim was not processed. So that is part of your overall customer experience with that. You're not happy. Now, does that mean that the system that you use to do that was part of that problem? And that might not be that at all. That you were able to process your claim, you got it through, you were able to track it, you knew where you were at every step of the way, and you had great user experience with the ability to process a claim. Now, on the other hand, you can put in a claim, and let's say that claim is actually approved, but the user experience of the solution in order to get that claim approved was absolutely horrendous. You had no ability of knowing where you were in line, when you were going to get your claim processed. If you made a decision, would that take you all the way back to the beginning of the process? A lot of that opaqueness that sometimes, government gets blamed for is something that becomes the user experience that technology can be used to help, make better for somebody. So that's where user experience can absolutely cause bad customer experience. But that ultimately doesn't mean that, that person walks away and is like, okay, I still, my customer experience is not great with government because of this situation, even though my claim was processed. So I think that's where people need to kind of understand the difference on that, because they aren't the same experience. And also from the digital transformation and technology perspective, it can only do so much. There's still a human factor, and there's still going to be a lot of things that have to happen for a customer that may not be a direct relationship with what can be controlled under a technology solution.
I thought it was very easy to follow, and I love the example you gave. Like, oh, I can use that next time. I can ask that.
You go right ahead.
One thing I want to touch on really fast about user experience and the customer experience is accessibility. That's something that's also been huge, and I know we've talked about it.
We focus on it a lot.
Yeah. And so just if your experience with accessibility with 508, I'm sure with your experience, you've had to see it both from the government constraints and then also from companies trying to meet these requirements to make sure that, whatever product is accessible.
Yeah, so accessibility and 508 compliance is considered, it's got the name compliance in it. Like, it's a checkbox. Like, are you compliant? Have you met your requirements to make this, accessible for somebody? But that has nothing to do with the user experience of what somebody who has challenges in accessing technology actually goes through. So when you're thinking about designing with accessibility, bringing that up front and not making it the afterthought at the end that says, okay, we're done with our what we've built, even in our snackable size. Oh, did we do our compliance check? Okay, we did. And look at all these big problems. Well, let's just push those off to the next release then.
Yeah.
So you said, like, how do I not, get technical debt? That would be, accessibility is probably a huge technical debt because you're like, we got to get this done. We've got to get this out into somebody's hands. But oh no, we have all these things that we missed on accessibility. Okay, well, that's not as important as getting something out the door. But it is if you are the person using it. And so that's where it really comes down to is, building with that idea that the human has to be able to use it in whatever form or format that they can access it, obviously, is a big deal. And so bringing that up front, and especially from companies who are in the space, I, say we need to champion this. We need to be thinking about it from the very front, as well as there's a couple other areas to bring in. Everyone understands security. A lot of times it is also tacked in at the end, as well as sustainability. And there's new, I think, executive orders or thoughts around executive orders coming around sustainability. How do you leave a lower footprint of what you're building, and how do you conserve as much, resources as you can in coming to that? Well, that all goes back to design. And you've got the technology that says we can do all these things. It's how do you knit those together to make the best solution right away, as opposed to saying, okay, we've built the thing, but we may have to unravel it later because we've already, put this all together. Well, that's not the time you do it. Like, you do it at the very beginning when you're thinking through it all, and then you get your pattern, and then you can figure out how to make that more optimized as you go along and build better skills around it, or bring in better people to kind of look at that and understand it from a better perspective. There's a lot of exceptions that the government always plays and says, we can make this exception. We can always make this exception. Yeah. I don't think accessibility should be an exception, and it shouldn't just be compliance either. So that's one of the areas that, again, we as advocates of, I think, the end user at the Digital Service Coalition is really looking to kind of uplift and bring forward is how do we show that? How do we demonstrate that? And from that customer experience, customer is everyone. And from the user experience, user is everyone. Yeah. So not just focusing on who today has the biggest need, but how do you do it for everyone?
Nice. I will say, I know we've been looking into DEI, and one of our colleagues found there's actually, so with compliance for 508, right, I'm always thinking about like screen readers or color contrast, but those are really just like the baseline of accessibility. She found a website that's Cards for Humanity, and it's cool. It flips up random cards and different experiences people might be having that I think we're going to start bringing in just to start practicing, thinking about accessibility wider than just color contrast issues. Because there's more than just that out there. So just our team can grow in our breadth of like, what are we considering? We have another colleague who is doing the sustainability part. So MetroStar is growing that. Like, how do we think about these things to have the smaller footprint? We don't have all those answers yet, but we're working on learning about those things to think about them from the get-go rather than, oh yeah, we should be doing this. How do you do it?
We have a couple of the companies in the DSC who've released accessibility playbooks. Okay. You can access that we have a Medium blog that just recently talked about that, as well as one of the companies who helped the Department of Justice redesigning the ADA webpage and giving tips around how to bring accessibility more into that. So I think this is becoming a bigger topic. not bigger topic. I think it's becoming a more important topic.
Yeah, it's like having some light on it more. Yeah.
Exactly. Like it's not the thing, again, not the end of the contract, not the thing you tack on at the end, but how do you bring it up to the front? Yeah. So, I think that as people are talking about playbooks and the best practices, and even staffing from that perspective, who do you have on your teams? What is their knowledge and how do they think about accessibility? And it isn't just that you have an accessibility compliance manager who goes in and tries to even work within your team to be like, okay, wait, have you thought, okay, this isn't going to work, like elevating that role up too, and making, or having accessibility training within all roles so that they're understanding it from that perspective is also something that companies can do to help elevate that, I think, internally as well.
This is a topic that's very passionate to us. I feel like we could go on and on for it. We're very big advocates, and I love how you said it's not something you tack on at the end. It has to be at the forefront. So it's something that I know that we're all very passionate about. Maybe you'll be a guest on the next podcast. We're talking about accessibility.
We have some wonderful experts in the Digital Services Coalition that I would probably defer to some of them who actually are very, very passionate about it. And they're the ones that are kind of educating me a lot more on this perspective as well. From inside government, it was always, okay, yes, we know we have to have this compliant. How do I check the box, or how do I make the exception, or how do I get around what I have to do because this is going to slow down and people get upset with timelines and stuff like that. And it's okay, but what really happens and what is the cost of that? And I think that is the question that needs to be asked in that perspective. And that's not always asked in contracts, and that's not always asked. But I think from digital transformation perspective, and where companies can come forward with this and say, this is what we believe in, and this is how we're going to do it in your world, and putting that as part of your upfront center, as part of your solutions that you provide to the government. That's a big thing, I think, to put in and say, we lead with this kind of design. We don't tack it on at the end. And this is what, when you work with us, what your expectation is of getting. Now, does that mean you're going to win every contract that you go for, that people are looking for something different? No. But as we standardize and make that more of a, something that people are going to look at and say, oh, okay, they've got the accessibility thing, that check mark is going to move from the back end of the contract to the upfront solicitation phase, and maybe even become evaluation factors. And that's where that really makes the difference, is how are you building in accessibility as an evaluation factor is something that, what we should be seeing on these kinds of contracts, and not something that is like, did you meet your 508 compliance? Yeah. And the way you say those two things even sounds completely different, even though they are exactly the same thing. So,
right.
Awesome. Well,
go for it.
Let's say, before we wrap up this podcast, we wanted to, and thank you for joining us. We have, just like we did on our previous podcast, we have a fun question that we're asking. And so during podcast 1 of our 2-part series with you, we asked you about some promising design happenings in government. This is a fun question, which will be, if you could choose to live inside of one phone application for the rest of your life, think of like Wreck-It Ralph, which app would you want to live inside of?
So, as I mentioned, I've been in the federal government for 20 years, which kind of dates me a little bit. So my answer to this one is actually going to go a little old school, MySpace. And
oh my gosh.
Yes,
what was it, Tom?
Yes,
best friend.
Exactly.
Protected your privacy.
It did. You had your blog, you had your music, you had your customizable page and your experience and your identity that you could tell people. And the social media apps of today, I don't like, because they don't really give you that. Like, it's all about, okay, who are you? Like, where's your postings? Where you're coming from? And it doesn't really give you that individual like flair that you have. Yeah. And so I wish that they would update MySpace and I would just live there. So I loved MySpace when it came out.
You picked your own color scheme and your fonts, and
you had your top friends, and and if you weren't happy with your friends, you put them on your, you're not on my top 10 anymore. Like,
that's how
those
you
are
knew.
Easy.
Yeah. Pissed off a friend. You're like, oh shoot.
Exactly. They're not on my top 10 anymore.
Yeah.
Okay. But I love the creativity of that and the ability to kind of, you had a communication, but as people came to your experience, and I think a lot of the social media stuff is like you pushing out your stuff and hoping other people look at it. And I don't necessarily, I'm not the biggest fan of that piece of like that idea and stuff. So that's just me personally. So
that was great. That was cool. Well, first off, we want to thank you for joining us again for our podcast. And also, before we say our goodbyes, could you let our listeners know where they can learn more about the DSC?
Yeah, so we have our website, which is digitalservicescoalition.org. We also have LinkedIn. And as I mentioned, we have a Medium, which is accessible through our webpage, but also you can find us on LinkedIn as well.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for letting me chat with you guys. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, this is awesome. This is Mocket. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends. And listen next time. If you're interested in learning more about how tech and government collide, visit MetroStar.com and follow us on our socials.